My name is Zachary Davis, and I'm privileged and pleased to introduce my friend and colleague of many years, Feroz Hassan Khan, who has just arrived. And I'm sure many of you can relate to the experience of getting to the badge office and having to go through the process. I hope we're not technically cursed this morning. Feroz is here to talk about a new book that he has just published. And it is a tale that goes through the history of South Asia and how we got to where we are today, which is baffling in many ways. Feroz is the author of many books, including The Definitive History of the Pakistan Nuclear Program, Eating Grass. He's a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School and is here today to talk to us about his new book on the Subcontinent Adrift. Feroz, are you ready? Please. Feroz Khan.
Thank you very much. So I've got a copy for you, Zach, for your CGSR. Thank you so much. My apologies, driving 101 these days is very different, so my time and space was totally lost in addition to the badge office. So thank you so much for your kind introduction. And I have to give a little bit of a background as to how this book came about. The story of my being in the United States and this book is somewhat coinciding, along with this gentleman who just introduced me. The idea of this book actually emanated before 9/11 in the summer of 2001, when Stanford University organized a conference titled South Asia 2020 that was looking at India and Pakistan that had just become two new nuclear armed power at the turn of the century, as to what would it look like in 20 years since then. So this book was precisely timed to look as to what were we thinking at the time, and then what happened and what pathway the region went through. Now, it's important to note that at that time, when we assembled almost everyone who was an expert in South Asia, was more concerned about the rise of China at that time, and little was given a thought as to what might be happening, what did happen in September 11 that year. And that immediately by the end of that year, by the time the conference was held and the papers were written, the context of global changed. And that's where the two nuclear armed countries, India and Pakistan, that had just tested 3 years before that, that whole dynamics changed with the factor of counterterrorism, or terrorism, if you will. In the first 5 years, at the time when all these things was conceived, India and Pakistan had gone through many wars and several crises. At least two of them were very important. One was the Kargil War, and the second was a long standoff that was for nearly a year. And my friend Zach Davis has written a book on that, and the other book on Kargil has been written by Peter Levoy. And these two books are really definitive ones, edited volumes that actually talks a great deal about what we were thinking about in terms of doctrines, in terms of command and control, in terms of confidence building measures or future of arms control, and exactly what it means to have two nuclear armed powers at the turn of the century. Did not have any answers. But looking into the strategic futures at that time, there were three main streams of ideas that came from that conference. The first stream was somewhat a cautiously optimistic theme that thought that once nuclear weapons are into the play, then there was this forlorn hope that India, Pakistan are sober actors and they would somehow or the other read a modus vivendi of actually paring down their maximalist expectations and reach some sort of a détente. And that school of thought was actually stemming from an immediate event that happened within a year of India-Pakistan's conducting nuclear test, and that was the Lahore Agreement between Pakistan and India. That was the basis of that optimism, and I belong to that one of those optimistic school of thought at the time, and I still am today, because I was part of that Lahore Memorandum of Understanding, and I knew what the both sides had thought at that time. Essentially, when such kind of enduring rivalry happens, it's not just region specific to India and Pakistan. It could be the Korean Peninsula, it could be Middle East, it could be other countries in the world. But you immediately get to know when negotiations start what has been the maximalist position of each country and where, to the extent they are likely to come down to settle the issue. But then there are organizational pathologies, bureaucracies, and many other cognitive biases that does not let the conflicts get resolved. And that is one of the things that I actually talk a great deal in this book, what a drift actually means and who causes the drift between it. And I've seen that myself. I've been part of that bureaucracy that actually does all that and did all that, regrettably. But that stream of thought was coming optimistic. The second school of was not optimistic. And that was coming basically from the war that happened within a year that was called the Kargil War and the standoff that was happening. And that school of thought said that Indian-Pakistani issues are so complex that they are likely to go through crisis after crisis, really at the brink of escalating nuclear wars. And the issues are deeply ideological. They are deeply embedded in some sort of a power struggle within the region, affected by the global power issues. So, and then there are territorial and unresolved issues. So these issues are not likely to be solved. And India and Pakistan, in the word of Stephen Cohen, would be to muddle through South Asia, would be muddling through. And that's what we exactly saw, that those who were optimistic did not. There was a third stream of thought that so who's going to offset all this tendencies? Who's going to be the offshore balancer? And everybody agreed that the United States is the only country that can actually influence and take the lead. And neither China, Russia was not even a player, and European Union was not much interested. So the burden still fell on the US, and I still believe it is still the same today. So those were the background idea that this book started. I picked up the book again because in the between, as thank you introduced, I was writing Eating Grass, The Making of the Pakistani Bomb, and I've talked so many times here on this forum. It's so nice to be back after these COVID days, so thank you again for inviting me. I picked up this book in 2014, once the Modi government took power, and I said, this is a very different phenomena that we have known so far. And by that time, the Chinese leadership had changed, leadership in India had changed, and somewhat leadership in Pakistan had changed after a long rule of military. We were looking in the second decade. In fact, Zach and I had done a sort of event just before that called Nuclear Learning in the Second Decade. That was the beginning of the second decade of India and Pakistan going nuclear. So I picked up the thing that with the central bluff, I would say, baseline, that stability at this, it was a tri-junction, not just a dyadic dispute, but actually it is a tri-junction of three nuclear armed powers who actually meet geographically at one location, which is the disputed territory of Kashmir. Now, it's very little realized geography as to where the three countries actually meet is right at Kashmir, which is disputed, and disputed differently by each country. So each claim, India and Pakistan claim the whole of each other's territory, but the Chinese have a different approach because to them, it is the border alignment which actually allows them the access between Tibet and Xinjiang, and that the Chinese critical interest is to find an access from Xinjiang into the Arabian Sea. And that's where the partnership with Pakistan becomes so critical, in which they have been investing for 60 years as we speak. That partnership was cemented in the 62 war, after the 62 war, when Pakistan quickly realized that it could meet the same fate what India met in 1962 if it does not quickly negotiate and settle the border dispute with China. So there were three areas that Chinese claimed. One was what is present day called Arunachal Pradesh in India. The second is the Aksai Chin again, which is on the eastern Ladakh side. And the third was called the Shaksam Valley, which is today the Pakistani-administered Kashmir, northern area. Immediately after the 62 war, there were a series of negotiations between India and Pakistan directly to resolve the state of the dispute of Jammu and Kashmir. But 6 rounds of that talk failed, whereas there were 6 secret rounds of talk between Foreign Minister of China and Pakistani Foreign Minister, and they reached a secret agreement in March 63 in which Pakistan ceded that territory. That meant nothing to the Pakistanis, but it was a lifeline for the Chinese because that was a real access without which Xinjiang and Tibet could not have linked each other. That cemented the relationship which is today called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the Belt Road Initiative of China and is an essentially critical component of today's great power competition. I just wanted to give the context as to how South Asian rivalry has this context of today's great power competition and what was rooted in that. So it's important to recall. What I call strategic drift, which is the title of today's talk, is essentially defined by one of the authors, a British author, I guess, Chester Crocker, who said that this is a disorderly mix of turbulence and drift in major powers and key regional states. And when that state of affairs comes, especially when nuclear weapons are involved in the process, what does this actually drift mean? I mean, international system does drift. So we began a lot of projects looking at China, India, and Pakistan together. Is that a strategic triangle? Are they 3 interdependent actors? What levels of analysis is important for India and Pakistan and India and China? My own view is that these are 2 asymmetric dyads. There's India and China dyad, and there is a Pakistan and India dyad. And each of these dyads have got 3 distinct subsets as to how this dyadic rivalry actually form, rather than truly a triangular relationship. India and China are competing at the system level as rising Asian power. They always thought like that. So that rivalry is of a very different nature because the power asymmetry between China and India is of a very different kind. They're identical huge countries. But the territorial dispute between China and India is merely a border dispute, not territorial claim of a large size. Maybe India would say it differently because the Chinese almost claim a whole state of India in the northeast. But essentially it is not. And the third is ideological in the sense that is more about the system of government in China and the democratic system in India and the kind of nature of societies. But I actually argue that it is not. The China-India is a managed rivalry, but the real complexity is the India-Pakistan rivalry, which is much more deep and much more complex and much more frequent. And the unpredictability of this is far greater than the predictability. And I can go on with Q&A sessions as to why the China-India rivalry is a managed rivalry, because and there are enough proof to do so. India-China's level of engagement at the global level, at the regional level, at the bilateral level, based on treaties and based on economic interdependency is much, much greater than the absence of the same with Pakistan, even though they have shared common history, language, and everything together. But the way India and Pakistan have drifted apart, the Chinese Indians were never close in a cultural or in a historical sense. But in a strategic sense, it is a very peculiar kind of rivalry that one day it is a security rivalry, the other day, another day, the same week is an economic cooperation, and the third day they're meeting at a forum at the global level, such as BRICS, like called Brazil, Russia, India, China, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or somewhere in the UN. And another day they are part of a Quad, India. So if you look into from Monday to Friday, India is on a different forum all day. In 2020, when the whole world was shut down, We were all under shelter. India and China were fighting a border war in May 2020. You remember where we were all at that time? In a critical sector. But by the end of the year, for the first time, the bilateral trade between China and India had crossed 100 billion. So, I mean, that indicates the kind of, and then all the crises that have happened on the China-India border that year and 5 years back in Doklam were resolved either in a BRICS conference or at a summit meeting, while the generals and the bureaucrats didn't negotiate the border areas. None of this pattern resembles anything when it comes to India and Pakistan. When it comes to India, Pakistan, there are various doctrinal things. That's the dialectic of the two really opposing powers. One is trying to find a place under the sun, that is India, and the other is challenging that rise. So India wants to have its own Monroe Doctrine in South Asia, only then it can be a nation power to rival China, where Pakistan will resist that very thing because it just undercuts the very existence why it became a separate country. And in that process, the Pakistanis are killing themselves with the process. But they are competing not to be dominated. And in that process, it gets into conventional arms race, it gets into subconventionals, it gets into nuclear, it gets into this strange sort of a mixture of 3 levels of contest, subconventional, conventional. So that is how the game is played now with the twin crises. Each country has got a nested security dilemma, where China has got many other fronts to deal with. It's kind of a distraction for them on subcontinent. But it is such a sensitive area for China that they cannot fully distract because Tibet borders India and Xinjiang borders Pakistan. These are the two volatile provinces the Chinese are so nervous about, and they're not Han Chinese. So the main focus on the eastern seaboard, you of course already know very well. That is China's main front, South China Sea and East Sea, with the pivot to Asia and Quad, and historically Taiwan and other areas, which are far more main front for them. So on the secondary front, it's sort of a distraction for them, for the Chinese, and therefore they just keep their. But you can see how China and India are engaging that I just mentioned. The critical factor here becomes Pakistan and China relations, because that essentially began as a military to military or in nuclear cooperation to have a counterbalance of India, so India remains a regional power locked with Pakistan before. So what China would simply do is bolster Pakistan's confidence, and after you can keep balancing with India, and that South Asia will be dealt by the Chinese until the new factor comes, United States. And that factor completely tilted the balance in the region in a way that US-Pakistan relations started going down as India-US relations began to deepen, with problems, of course. So in the end, US has problems both with Pakistan and as well as with India of a different nature. But both countries are critical to the US interests for different reasons. And in the end, the Chinese know how to play this game. This is much before Russia and Ukraine war is happening. This is the setting in which this whole drift is shaping place, So many people think that this is a triangular nuclear contest. If you want, I think you're familiar with the Chinese nuclear doctrines, etc. I will not go much into those doctrines. but we observe that what used to be a minimum deterrent idea from China is not really minimum deterrent anymore. The nature of Chinese modernization that is happening, which you are well familiar with, is rattling India a lot. And India is now modernizing based on what the Chinese are doing, whether or not that affects India directly or not. The fact is that India is getting bolstered from Western technology that is involving Pakistan in the process. And therefore, the Chinese are bolstering Pakistanis. Even the Russians are trying to do that, but the Russians are very expensive. So there is a contest between Russia and China over Pakistani demand, but the Pakistanis don't have any money. They are really crumbling under. I mean, after Sri Lanka, Pakistan is the next in line. So they are really starving. And my book was called Eating Grass, the Making of the Bomb, actually is indicating where the Pakistani dilemma today is and has always been the case. So then these people, India and Pakistan, started playing with different doctrines. And I just want to say a few words on that, and I'll open up because I don't want to take too much time. I don't know how much you have to say. So I'll talk about the current doctrinal things that is going on in the region and something what the futures are, and then I'll open up for Q&A. Is that, sir, okay? To the doctrinal dissonance which is really happening now, is that important? Thank you. Is essentially that India that had declared a doctrine of a no first use, a doctrine of a minimum credible deterrent, as India had very peculiar concepts in those doctrines, it will maintain a credible deterrent force. It will have a no first use. It will massively retaliate in response to a nuclear attack, or in the event if Indian forces are attacked with chemical weapons or biological weapons. These are the four key components of India's declared policy. So India's adversaries, I don't know how the Chinese would see, but they see that this is very flexible in their interpretation. It's very fluid in terms of the force goals, as it is, And the no first use is the conditional no first use. So many other scholars have really thought that India has probably a decoupled policy of really carrying out a first use policy with Pakistan if things go wrong, because Pakistanis will not pledge a first use. And they kind of pledge a no first use with the Chinese with certain conditionalities. And the Pakistanis simply would say, look, I cannot promise you that I'm not going to use nuclear weapons. So India wants to use its conventional might against Pakistan, start a war called limited voluntary nuclear doctrine, and finish the war on its terms and conditions, hoping nuclear weapons will not be used. To undercut that, the Pakistanis have put an integrated conventional and nuclear capability right into the face of Indian conventional force. They call it full spectrum deterrence. In fact, it's a combination of two doctrines called comprehensive response, meaning they will comprehensively respond to every conventional move of India, and in addition mix tactical weapons and nuclear weapons in the case. They call it full spectrum deterrence. So there are two distinct doctrines that came out from Pakistan. One in writing, the other one is verbal. The Pakistanis don't put nuclear doctrines in writing, but they say it. In fact, they talk a lot more about nuclear doctrines than they write. So this combination, this dialectic between India and Pakistan has actually caused this kind of a drift. In the end, India realized that it cannot massively mobilize, given the geography, to go and really cross into Pakistan and slice it into the two without the use of nuclear weapons. So they kept on guessing what are the nuclear thresholds, and the Pakistani kept on playing this cat and mouse, hide and seek game with them for almost a decade or so, until they realized that any risk, any operation that goes cross-border is likely to escalate. So the cost of escalation and the cost of war is going to be greater no matter how. Then India came out with an innovative strategy during the Modi regime called surgical strike stratagem, which is never clear what it is. It means that precision strike, whether it's use of air force or use of special forces, cross-border attack, do something, come back very quickly, and make a domestic claim that we did a punitive attack on Pakistan in response to Pakistan's perceived Pakistani terrorism operations in India. While both countries really mastered subconventional war of utilizing each other's, with India doing in Balochistan and using Afghanistan, and Pakistan as usual doing Kashmir and elsewhere where Indian dissidents are to the east and all. In fact, in 25 years after the nuclear test, initially we thought India and Pakistanis are hurtling into crisis because of inexperience, what we used to call unlearning or not learning the nuclear revolution. But now India and Pakistanis have actually perfected the art of how to stabilize and how to destabilize. So this paradox is part of an accepted doctrine in the region, And that is what it's that they are controlling violence against each other, knowing that the escalation is bad for both of them. So India's surgical strike, and one demonstration of that was in 2019. So then the Pakistanis come with a response, which is even more curious, and they call India's surgical strike response is called quid pro quo plus. Now, they actually mean tit for tat, but I don't know why they call it quid pro quo. But it's even if you take the English translation verbatim, it actually, the plus part makes it a little more difficult, because what does that actually mean, plus? And that's never been explained clearly, because we do a lot of track twos. Does a plus mean in kind? So if you do an airstrike here, I'm going to do two airstrike. If you're going to have a long-range ballistic missiles coming with a conventional warhead, you hit two targets, I'm going to hit four. Or is it qualitative change, We have done many tabletop exercises to figure this out, and it doesn't seem that neither India nor Pakistan truly know. What it actually does is that it clearly creates so much of misunderstanding that it starts escalating into a very different war. It's impossible to believe that nuclear weapons will not come into use, because they don't use it in exercises, but that doesn't mean we don't connect the dots. That's what's the dilemma here, that even though the violence level as this thought of doing total war on each other, reduced to limited war, reduced to surgical strikes, you can see that there's a scale of violence going down, but they don't change their principal position, which gets into that they don't learn the lessons. It's unlearning of the lessons, that they don't change their objectives. They simply do simple learning by trying to nuance various strategies rather than learning the complexity and saying certain objectives are unachievable. At this point, as I speak, this is where we are stuck. So I write about in the book about the three futures, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I live in Carmel, so I have to use my Clint Eastwood's phrase. So that's my last three chapters about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I still maintain the good future still remains in a structural dialogue between India and Pakistan, whose foundation was laid 25 years ago in 1999 early, between Mr. Vajpayee and the Sharif government. And that foundation is the structure from where many of the ideas, and I've written a lot about. Not only that, because of the complexity of bilateral between India and Pakistan, of late I've been proposing that it has to be a trilateral confidence building measure, including involving China as well. And I've written separately on that. I can take more Q&A sessions on that. The reason I'm mentioning about the Chinese involvement is that those who are into the arms control business would probably know that India and China had signed two agreements in 1993 and 1996, which, in my opinion, is one of the best conventional arms control agreement anywhere, if you really go through the details as to how to maintain the border security and how to maintain arms control on that particular part. And Pakistan and India had the Lahore and several other CBMs of the same kind, but not conventional agreement of that level that India and China have. Pakistan and India have a very different kind of confidence building measures and none of the arms control measures. But if you combine the ideas, you can easily create how to reduce strategic risks and how to continue with negotiation of political process. I don't write much about political process, it's always long, but that's a good future that they can still pick up at any time. There's some good news coming from South Asia that, again, I mentioned Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India is hosting in May in Goa. And the good news is that they've invited the Pakistanis to come and attend. These are the kind of things which are good gestures. India-Pakistan front has been quiet for quite some time now. That's not bad, even though blurbs keep on going to each other, but India-Pakistan have not. Afghanistan-Pakistan has gone bad, not as bad as we thought, but that front, that is a very dangerous thing happening again, because the counter-terror cooperation with the US is sort of reviving, but the resurgence of those terror ecosystem is now seeping back from Western Pakistan. China-India front is relatively quiet now, and we don't find much news. So it's good to be quiet, and therefore a good future is available. bad is already bad. Between India and Pakistan, nothing is resolved. So I don't want to say much about bad. The only thing is that it can get ugly. And the ugly thing is because the absence of these structures can lead to anywhere which I already explained. And it can get really bad and ugly. And that is so because now India has now evolved itself into something called a gray zone strategy with Pakistan. Do what you do, subconventional to subconventional, conventional to conventional, nuclear to nuclear. That's the current government strategy, and that's where there's this stalemate, and both sides are waiting and sort of killing each other. Pakistan is in a very big economic mess at the moment. Sri Lanka has had very great crisis. India's neighborhood is in trouble. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, all countries are facing a lot of problems at the moment. Even Bangladesh is not doing as well as it was. So all of India's neighborhood is problematic. There is domestic unrest in India for various reasons. So if you're looking into concentric circle within India, domestic, and then periphery with the neighbors, including China, and then you look India's role in the global areas, what is happening is that India is trying to play a role at the global level, ignoring what is happening on the field inside India. And I'm arguing that that's a very dangerous tendency because if you don't take along your regional neighbors with you, they're going to pull you down while you're trying to compete at the global level. That is the drift that I talk about in the end that continues, but I'm still hopeful that at the regional level, a good future continues to wait as long as the dialogue process starts. That's all, sir.